Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. It's really special to be back at Brentview. It's a special moment when a pastor gets to go back to one of the communities that he's been involved in leading and to see old friends and then to have the opportunity to make new friends. And I do realize this morning that I am unknown to many of you, so I felt like I should probably start out with an apology for the really terrible accent. I get it, it's bad. I'm from Northern Ireland, so there's sometimes when I sound exactly like Pete. And then we moved to Canada and spent 10 years here and became Canadians, and so sometimes I sound exactly like you. And then we've been living in Australia for the last 3 and a bit years, and so sometimes I just sound like Crocodile Dundee. And so it's going to be all over the place this morning, and there are no subtitles available. So you're just going to have to lean in a little bit if that's okay. I was speaking at a conference recently, actually, and somebody came up to me and they're like, "Oh, Steve, you sound like that old actor Liam Neeson." And I thought, oh, that's cool. And then I realized that's actually so offensive. Because Liam Neeson now he's got a terrible North American accent and a terrible Irish accent. And then I thought about it and I was like, you know what, actually that's not, I identify slightly with Liam Neeson, especially his character in the old movie Taken. I don't know if you've seen the Taken film franchise. He's a retired CIA agent and his daughter gets kidnapped and he gets a phone call from the kidnappers. If you can remember the movie, you'll remember this moment. This is what he says to the kidnappers in that weird kind of North American Irish accent. He said, "I don't have money." So that's like my first point of identifying with Liam Neeson's character, being a pastor and all that. But he says, "But I don't have money, but what I do have is a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a very long career, skills that make me a nightmare for people like you." And one of the things I've discovered over a very long career is I have a very particular set of skills. I can talk for a very long time, and that can make me a nightmare for people like you. This morning, though, what I want to invite you to do is to lean in with me into the terrible accent, into this sermon, and I really just have one thing that I want to share with you, one kind of theological idea that I would love us to just sit around, camp out at today, and I think it's going to be worth your time, it's going to be worth our time as we gather together this morning. St. Augustine, one of the important kind of fathers of our faith, was reflecting on the cross and the resurrection of Jesus and the impact that that makes and what it means. And he said this, it's really beautiful. He said, "And he departed from our sight," he's speaking about Jesus, "he departed from our sight that we might return to our heart and there find him. For he departed and behold, he is here." About 15, maybe 17 years ago, one of my first trips out to Calgary, to Brentview, I'd been invited out to speak at a conference for young adults. And actually, I can see many of the young adults that were at that conference are actually here today. And the title of that conference was Residence. The pastor at the time, Ken Castor, had this vision of us sitting together around the idea that God has come and taken up residence in our hearts. And it's kind of cool that all these years later, here I am, I'm back again, and this is what's really on my heart to share with you today, this beautiful idea that we are invited into. This week, whenever we travel back to Australia, I'm going to be meeting with the staff of our church there in Perth. I got an email this week letting me know that the meeting that we're going to be having this week is to plan the services for Easter 2025. And I took a deep breath and I couldn't believe it because Christmas is just over and all of a sudden we're thinking about Easter. We move so quickly at times through our church calendar, but also through the important ideas of our faith, that we don't stick around long enough to actually pay attention to the beauty and the power of the conversations that we're invited into with God. Back in 2011, Rebecca and Izzy and Shay and I left Northern Ireland and we moved here to Calgary. It was absolutely shocking for us coming to Calgary. In November, I think it was like minus 20 already. I didn't even know that was a temperature. And we got to Calgary, and the thing that really took our breath away was the size of everything. When you move from tiny little Northern Ireland to great big Canada, everything is big. The trucks, they're so big. The cartons of milk, They're so big. The fridges to keep the cartons of milk. Like everything here is so big. And I remember our first time going out to the Banff National Park and seeing the Rockies. And coming from Northern Ireland, where our mountains are really just hills, seeing the Rockies just took our breath away. I have to tell you about our first time driving through the Banff National Park. It was late in the afternoon. The sun was going down. It was beautiful. And it started to snow. It was like Narnia. It was magical. We were just absolutely loving it. There we were as a family. We're just moseying along through the parkway. And all of a sudden, in my rear view mirror, the blue flashing lights came on. I couldn't believe it. My first time in Banff National Park, and I got pulled over by the sheriff. And I knew I was in trouble. Well, at least with my wife, I knew I was in trouble. So I pulled the car to the side of the road, and then it was like a scene in a movie. As I look in the mirror and I see the sheriff, she gets out of her car, she puts on a big cowboy hat. And I'm like, whoa, this is surreal. And then she walks up and taps the window, rat-a-tat-tat, and I put the window down, and then she said, "Sir, do you know why I've stopped you today?" And the thing is, I actually didn't know why she'd stop me, so I assumed maybe I was going too fast, maybe I had been driving on the wrong side of the road. That happens, Pete, right? Like whenever you move here, that totally happens. And she said, "Sir, I'm stopping you today because you're driving suspiciously slow." I had been so caught up in the moment, in the mountains, in the beauty, that I had just backed off the accelerator and we were just driving so slowly. So now I'm like the only person you know that's ever been stopped by the police for driving too slow. But that actually happened. But one of the things that I've realized, particularly as I've got older, is there's something beautiful about slowing down and paying attention and to staying a little bit longer in important things and important ideas. N.T. Wright said that Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of God's new project, not to snatch people away from earth, but to colonize earth with the life of heaven. God has come to take up residence in our hearts, in our lives, in our families, in our communities, in our church. And this is too important an idea to just throw out and then just to get in the car and head on down the road. Like we need to stop here. We need to think about this. This has the potential to change everything. One of my favorite authors, in fact, as a family, we love this author. He's an American. His name is Bob Goff. Now, I'm going to assume that many of you know of the work of Bob Goff because David Friesen is one of your pastors. And in my mind, he's the Canadian Bob Goff. But Bob Goff is a wild man for Jesus. His books are incredible. They tell his stories. He's a pilot. He's a preacher. He's an author. He's a lawyer. In fact, he takes all his meetings at Disneyland. That's where his office is. When he publishes his books, he puts his mobile phone number, his cell phone number, in his books so that anyone on the planet who reads his book can call him at any time. Like, that is wild. Bob's a podcaster and a missionary, but probably my favorite thing about Bob Goff, and he tells this story in his book, Love Does, is that he is the consulate general for the country of Uganda. Because part of Bob's story was that he went to spend time in Uganda helping recovering children, child soldiers, victims of genocide. And along the way, he became great friends with the Governor General of Uganda. And now whenever the Governor General of Uganda comes to the US for, meeting of the United Nations or anything like that, he comes and he stays at Bob's house. But in order for that to happen, they had to turn Bob's house into a formal consulate, flag and all. In fact, I think there's going to be a picture come up on the screen of Bob Goff outside his house with the Consular General of Uganda and the flag. They turned his home into a consulate. Church, this is what happens in all of our lives. Because of Christ, because of his work on the cross, because of the resurrection, because of his appearing and his ascension, Christ has come to take up residence in all of our hearts. And by doing so, he has turned all of our lives and us as a shared community into a consulate of heaven, a place where he plants his flag and he says, "Behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." I want to talk to you for a few moments today about how that works, Like, how does this actually take place? At Christmas, we've just celebrated the birth of our Lord. As we head towards Easter, on Good Friday, we'll celebrate his death. On Easter Sunday, we'll celebrate his resurrection and triumph over the grave. Today, I want to pull us right into the very center of that story. Jesus is on the cross. He's singing through his tears and agony and anguish. He's singing to his Father, Psalm 22. He wants his last words, his last breath to be offered as a hymn of praise. And in the Gospel of Mark, and Mark is an abrupt, punchy little I think Mark was somewhat Irish. The Gospel of Mark is action-packed, and it kind of gets in your grill a little bit, gets in your face. He doesn't want to waste any time. He wants to get to the point. And as Jesus breathes his last, this is how Mark puts it. Mark 15:37 just says this: with a loud cry, Jesus breathes his last. So there we are. Jesus dies. Prince of Heaven, he's taken our place. He's Isaiah's suffering servant. He truly has come to lay down his life for us. And for the next 3 days, heaven waits with bated breath, right? And then something happens that hell had not anticipated at all: defeat. And in the final chapter of Mark kind of documents a story where Mary and Salome, 3 female Jesus followers, are going to the tomb. And they're going and they're having a conversation about who's going to roll away the stone. And an angel appears to them. And this is what he says to the 3 women. He says, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified." And then there's just this moment. It's so matter of fact. He just says this: he is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. I really appreciate that Mark goes out of his way to kind of demonstrate for us something that we know but we forget. And that is that this was a mismatch right from the outset. In our first couple of weeks in Calgary back in 2011, I had this lovely little neighbor who would come and say hi. And one afternoon he invited me to come and play volleyball. Now, I'm from Northern Ireland where we don't play volleyball. It's a height issue. And so in my mind, volleyball isn't a real sport. And the only time you ever play volleyball was whenever the youth pastor had run out of ideas or the high school gym teacher hadn't prepared a lesson and they threw up a net and you just punch a ball back and forward. No technique, no planning, no skills. You just don't even think of it as a real sport. So whenever this neighbor of mine up in Tuscany said, "Steve, would you like to come along with me and join our volleyball team for the evening?" I thought, oh yeah. Look, I was a semi-accomplished athlete. I was a rugby player, a soccer player. I could swing a golf club. Oh yeah, I could totally handle that. Anyway, I go along to this volleyball arena. And I'm 5'8". I'm now 5'7.5". That's what 10 years does to you when you get middle age. But I go along and I could not believe it. Every single person on that court was 7.5 feet tall. I believe it. And they had knee pads and elbow pads and sweatbands. And I was completely out of my depth. If I touched the ball once, I didn't know what I was doing with it. And I never got invited back. But it was a mismatch right from the start. And what Mark tries to articulate for us through the gospel is that death in the company of Jesus is like a 5-foot volleyball player in the presence of Olympians. It was a mismatch right from the start. We should not be surprised. When we think about Jesus, we should have known that death could not hold him. What I want to do for the next couple of minutes is just hit reverse. And I want to bring you back a couple of verses in Mark's gospel to a verse that we all know, we've all read, and then we've all sped away from. But if you were to ask me what I think is the definitive moment of that first Easter weekend, of the entire gospel itself, it would be contained within this one verse in Mark 15:38. Jesus has breathed his last and died, and before the angel comes and says he has risen, we're offered this incredible scripture. Mark 15:38 says, "The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Every good story has a tension point around the idea of accessibility. Any Star Wars fans in the room? You'll know that Luke Skywalker can't access a relationship with Darth Vader because of a really scary helmet. And of course, the dark side of the Force. If you follow C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Narnia is cut off from the outside world through 2 wooden doors of an old wardrobe. Lord of the Rings fans, the doors of Durin bar entrance into Moria under the misty mountains, unless you know how to speak Elvish. I know there are no Harry Potter fans here today because this is a church. But just in case there are, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, a 3-headed giant dog called, anyone know what it was called? Fluffy. Pastors, pay attention to who shouted that out. Fluffy blocks the entrance to the underground chambers. A key feature of every great story ever being told is a barrier between you and where you need to be, where you want to be. And the story of the Bible is no different. And the most vivid instance of this theme is a finely woven curtain hanging at the heart of the house of worship, separating the holy place from the most holy place, a place that exists that worshipers cannot go. Priests are allowed to minister in the holy place sometimes, but not often. The curtain, in effect, perpetually guarded the entrance to God and to his presence. And when Jesus dies, we are being informed of a tectonic shift where everything changes forever. The spiritual atmosphere changes, and Mark documents it in one verse. 2,000 years, theological and religious history comes to an end in this one moment. I'm sure some of you have had the opportunity to travel up to Iceland. Back in 2019, as a family, we stopped in Iceland on our way. We were in Europe. We were making our way back to Ontario. We had the opportunity to stop in Iceland for a couple of days. We were venturing outside of the city, and just north of Reykjavik, you actually can take a walk through a rift valley, and you walk up this little kind of meandering path, and on one side of the path is one tectonic plate, and on the other side of the path is another. On one side of you, on your left-hand side, is North America, and the other side is Europe and Asia. Like, that's crazy, right? To think about. And you're just like walking right up the middle, and so we would run back and forth and be like, oh, we're in America. And then run over the other side, we're in Europe and Asia. Back and forth, back and forth. This little tiny space up the middle, but what it represents is 2 entirely different continents. That's what this verse does in Mark 15. It defines 2 theological continents. And those of us who follow Jesus, we're invited to move from one and to move all the way across onto another. Professor Greg Lanier documents it in this way. He says, the tearing of the curtain was a prophetic symbol that the earthly temple approached its expiration date. When the curtain is torn, the worshipers, that's us, now have a new access to the Father through Christ. Scholar and professor Alan Brown, who's a good Aussie friend of mine, documents it in this way. He said, God's reign is no longer on a hill in Jerusalem. That's why God tore the curtain, and check out this phrase, and stepped out. God stepped out. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of the curtain being torn so that we could step in. But the truth is, the curtain was torn because God was stepping out. Today I've tried to ask the question, how is it possible that God has taken up residence in our hearts, in our lives, in our families, in our churches? The answer is found in Mark 15:38. Because God has torn the curtain. Through Christ. Temple curtain is our cue to know that God is out, God is on the move, God is real, God is here. I'd love to kind of finish this by trying to explain it with a real life story. Not that all my stories aren't real life, but over time they get embellished. But this one's real. I'm going to invite Pete and the team. They're going to come up and lead us in a response in a few moments. But back in August 2021, I was appointed to be the senior pastor of a church called Riverview Church out in Western Australia. And at that time, it was, if you can remember, was the global pandemic. And so at any other moment in history, that would have been so easy. You'd have just got on a plane, you'd have flown to Australia, got your flip-flops and your shorts and your sunglasses, and you're good to go. But there was a global pandemic, and so even leaving Canada was a challenge. Just to get out of Ontario, we had to go and visit doctors, pay loads of money to get lots of testing done and lots of paperwork, so that eventually the airline would give us tickets so that we could leave Canada. That was like step one on our journey to Australia. But then here's the thing, we could get out of Canada, but we couldn't get into Australia. So we had to park ourselves in the UK for a number of months and wait to be able to get into Australia. Now, here's the thing, part of our paperwork leaving Canada had to document that we didn't have COVID. And so we got the paperwork. We got on the plane. We arrived in London. And guess what? We got COVID on a plane filled with people who had documentation to say they didn't have COVID. What a time. So then we end up in quarantine for a couple of weeks in Belfast, and that was, you guys have all had COVID, I'm sure, and know the experience. You lose your taste buds, you're eating pizza, it's weird. But eventually, we get the paperwork to get into Australia, yes. And this is like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. To get paperwork to get into Australia during the pandemic was like, God had to move, and God did move, and we got paperwork. But now we needed to get to Australia. So we leave London and we have to stop off in Singapore. Now that in itself was an unbelievable experience. We got met off the plane in Singapore airport by men in hazmat suits with AK-47s. I'm not sure how they were planning to fight a bug in Singapore, but it involved a lot of weaponry. And we get ushered to a quarantine hotel where we were given a guard who sat outside our room with a machine gun to make sure that we didn't get out. It was absolutely traumatic and terrifying. And that's saying something. I grew up in Northern Ireland in the middle of a war. And I think I have more trauma from my overnight stay in Singapore. But eventually we're allowed to leave Singapore and we land in Western Australia. And we think, this is it, the beginning of our new life, except it wasn't. Because we arrived in Western Australia and guess what? We're met by soldiers and police officers, machine guns, more bullets. Again, I'm not sure what the scientists, how we were going to fight COVID. Definitely too many guns. We arrive in Australia, another quarantine, another 2 weeks. This time, we're in the Pan Pacific Hotel, downtown Perth. Beautiful windows overlooking a city that we're not allowed into. Now, I'm kind of telling you this old kind of story because I think it documents really well how all worship worked up until this moment when Jesus dies on the cross. Until Jesus dies on the cross, worship wasn't about where you could go, it was about where you couldn't go. It was about accessibility and our inability to have accessibility. Like you could go into the temple, but if you were a woman, you could only go so far. And if you were a Gentile, you could only go so far. And if you were a man, you could only go so far, only if you could pay the temple tax, only if you had the right sacrifices. Only if everything lined up, you could progress through, and eventually, maybe you're a priest, maybe after all your ritual washing, you can go to the holy place. Or maybe you're the high priest, and maybe once a year on the Day of Atonement with bells on in case you die, you can go into the most holy place behind the curtain. But all of worship was defined around where you could not go. And now in this moment, the curtain gets torn. And God moves out. And then he takes up residence by his Spirit in our lives as believers. That is awesome news, is it not? And one of the great things that I think that it does for us as Jesus followers is that it sets us free from running really fast. And it allows us to truly slow down. Because one of the saddest stories that I see in the contemporary church is an invitation to run hard after the presence of God like we still live in a time of the temple. Whenever God has come and taken up residence in all of our lives. Through his Son, by his Spirit. He's right here, right now. I think that's awesome. Pete, why don't you lead us in a song of worship so that we can experience God's presence with us here. Thanks, mate.